Friends,
Just request Sangeeta, can you just record the session, please?
Yes, she is.
It started, sir. Yeah.
Thank you.
Friends, warm welcome to all of you. And it's a great delight to first welcome you to the Festival of Leadership and Coaching event by this practice of entrepreneurial success. This year we decided that we will celebrate learning rather than see it as something we have to do. So, Dr. Shameen, you have the honor of kicking off the first celebration all the way from Shanghai. It's very special, and we cannot but hide the excitement for the fact that you share a very special connection with our own Dr. BJP, and I cannot hide it. So it adds to the delight for all of us. So wonderful to have you here. Thanks for being here, and we're all looking forward to it. And Doctor, great to have you here. Proud father. So over to you, Jagdish and Shriki, to get going.
Yes. Thanks. Thank you, Ganesh. Good evening, friends. Gives us immense pleasure to kick off this CFI festival, what we are talking of. And thanks, Ganesh, for giving the big picture. To use the startup language, we are starting a new pivot for CFI. Being close to the customers, understand different domains, and definitely entrepreneurship is one thing we are looking forward, and great to have Dr. Shameen Prashantham with us, the author of the book Gorillas Can Dance. To give a quick introduction to Dr. Shameen, is Professor of International Business and Strategy and Associate Dean MBA at the China Europe International Business School in Shanghai. His research, curiously called Dancing with Gorillas, you will listen to this. What does he mean? Very interesting anecdote and story as he has explained. How startups and large multinational corporations can partner with each other to improve the prospects of innovation and have a sustainable growth differentiation. He has done this research spanning over 15 years and included field work and teaching executives. He has given talks all around the world, as we were just talking, starting from Accra in Africa to Bangalore, Beijing, Berlin.
Yeah.
All over the world, he has been participating, doing field work and research, and his current focus is actually about sustainable development growth as defined by United Nations. Dr. Shameen Prashantham, thanks a ton for accepting our invite to be here with us. We are looking forward eagerly to listen about your book and interact with you. And this topic is quite exciting for us. It's not an easy task when we say collaboration between a corporate and a startup. Having ran such a corporate accelerator incubator program myself, I know the difficulties and challenges. It's about two cultures coming together. A culture that is agile, acting at speed, exploring possibilities, ready to fail in the path to a grand success, versus the other culture that wants ensured success through repeatable processes, optimum resource utilization, and no risk at all. So this is the two cultures that have to come together, and that's definitely an interesting meeting point. And you have taken a very apt topic for today's VUCA world, where there are so many uncertainties the corporates are facing, how they are going to gain agility and speed. So your book, definitely I read it, quite interesting, exciting, with so many models and frameworks that explains the why, how, and where, how corporate can partner. Actually, it's like a guidebook. Any corporate wanting to start can start with that, use that as a guide, and it's an excellent one as referred by many other eminent personalities all over the world. So we are eagerly looking forward. Thanks a ton. Looking forward to your initial talk about the book, Dr. Shameen, and later we'll have question answer and interactive session with all our audience. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Sri, for the very kind introduction, and to Mr. Chella for this kind invitation. I remember meeting him for the first time in December 2007, when we had a slightly early, 2-month early celebration for my father's 60th birthday. And Pradipta was there as well. So it is a long-standing association for our family, and I'm also very happy to see that my father is in the audience. Someone else who's in the audience is Mr. Dravida Sitaraman, who I don't know whether he actually remembers, but when I was at the very, very early stages of my research, he was one of the people that I had met when he was at IBM in government relations, and he kindly spared time for me. So this work on how large companies and startups partner is something that I happen to be working on as an academic researcher for over 15 years. And so that's what I've tried to bring together in the book. So what I will do is take you through some of the key ideas in the book. So I've been given about 40 minutes and I will do my best to cover this, but however much I get through in 40 minutes will still be a lot, I think. But I think the more interesting part will be the question and answer session to follow. And so we should make sure that that happens. So I'm just going to really take you through, give you a whistle-stop tour of the main contents of the book from start to finish, and then look forward to the discussion. I just also want to say that in the past few months since the book has come out, I've been fortunate to be invited by many companies actually to give this presentation. Henkel, Honeywell, most recently Porsche. But this is the first audience of coaching professionals that I am speaking to. And I think you have a particularly valuable facilitative role to bring together these very different cultures, as Sri articulated so well. So the book is titled Gorillas Can Dance, Lessons from Microsoft and Other Corporations on Partnering with Startups. And Microsoft in many ways is the lead case. That's what I start with in the prologue. I start with a quote that many people are surprised to see, but Steve Jobs once said, Microsoft is one of the few companies we were able to partner with that actually worked for both companies. Bill and Microsoft were really good at it because they didn't make the whole thing in the early days, meaning they didn't make the whole computer, the hardware, software. I mean, they focus only on the software, right? They didn't make the whole thing in the early days, and they learned how to partner with people really well. But what I discovered was even a company like Microsoft that has taken has taken partnering very seriously, had to develop a specific capability around partnering with startups. And one of the early milestones came in 2010 when they had what they called the BizSpark One Summit in California. And I happened to be able to attend that as an academic researcher and observing it. And the key guy there was a guy called Daniel Lewin, who at the time was corporate vice president at Microsoft, but as a young man had been part of the Macintosh team working at Apple. And he was the only non-techie that Steve Jobs took with him when he left Apple to set up Next. Daniel went on to do a couple of other gigs in Silicon Valley before reaching out to Steve Ballmer in 2000, after hearing a speech where Steve Ballmer had said something about how Microsoft has to now embrace a wider ecosystem of partners, including entrepreneurial companies. And basically Daniel said, well, Steve, if you're that interested, that's Steve Ballmer. So if you're that interested, you need to engage with Silicon Valley. And he became the person driving the activities of Microsoft from about 2001. But it wasn't until 2008 that they introduced their first programmatic intervention to engage with startups. They called it BizSpark. They basically gave away free software, and thousands of startups were interested. But then they identified the 100 most innovative startups amongst these thousands, created an elite partnering program called BizSpark One. And that's what got inaugurated in 2010. Now, as this program developed, a country that became very prominent because they started providing a lot of these startups to join this elite program was Microsoft's operations in Israel. And at the time, a very sort of middling level manager called Zach Weisfeld, a very dynamic sort of guy who had himself been an entrepreneur before, he said, well, what we're doing through BizSpark One is interesting, but surely there has to be a way to engage with startups, especially these Israeli startups who are so energetic and making an impact, work more closely with them. And so he made it his business to create a corporate accelerator where startups would come and work, selected startups, about a dozen or so, would be located in Microsoft premises for 4 months and have a structured program to develop skills on both technology and business, and then try to raise funding afterwards. This idea caught on very quickly, and accelerators were opened that same year in 2012 in Bangalore and Beijing, and then thereafter in London, Berlin, Paris, and then Seattle. And over time, as Satya Nadella became CEO, you see on his table a sign that says Microsoft loves startups, because he was championing cloud computing. He had begun that process even before he became CEO, and after he became CEO, it became central to their strategy. And startups were a big stakeholder, if you will, because this idea of cloud computing, that you didn't have to invest a lot in fixed costs for IT infrastructure, you could sort of pay for as much as you needed, became a godsend for these startups who could then build products relatively inexpensively compared to before. And this idea of Microsoft loving startups became a sort of a mantra. And this person in the picture next to Satya Nadella is James Chow, who runs Microsoft for startups in China. Now, what the Microsoft story tells us, and actually there's a much, much longer detailed narrative in the book, but the key takeaways is, first of all, even a tech giant could face disruption. Why was Microsoft doing all this? It's not surely out of charity. The fact of the matter was that even in Steve Ballmer's time, there was a clear recognition that things could not go on the same way. They saw themselves as a one-trick pony. They were great for PCs, but they could also see the writing on the wall that things would change. And they knew that to be able to develop new ideas, they would need to engage more broadly with companies outside, including startups. And there's a clear rationale, especially with the work of Satya Nadella, both before and after he became a CEO around cloud computing. Partnering with startups wasn't a gimmicky thing they were doing. They were doing because it made sense for strategy. And this became clearer and clearer over time. So there was a clear rationale for why. And then they were also figuring out how to do it. They started off with some models out of Silicon Valley, then they found something else in Israel that worked, and then these things evolved over time. And so they were figuring out how to co-create with these startups. But also, being a global company, they were trying to tap into startup ecosystems around the world. First in the West, then Israel, and then further east, notably in China and India. But now actually the global footprint is quite wide, and more recently they've been very active in Africa. And so the point is, gorillas can learn to dance. Now, when I had started my research over 15 years ago, I was initially looking at this phenomenon from the point of view of the startup, because I'd come across a few startups, both in Scotland and in Bangalore, that were trying to engage with large multinationals, the IBMs and Microsofts of the world in particular back then, with a view to leveraging these partnerships globally, actually, and hoping to internationalize. And I happened to be at a conference in 2006. I was a freshly minted PhD at the time, and totally in awe of C.K. Prahlad, who was being honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award or something. And then there was a Q&A session at the end. And then with great trepidation, I put my hand up and said, Professor Prahlad, I've begun noticing some startups trying to engage with large corporations. Do you think this is a good topic for a young academic to be studying? And he said, in my opinion, the startup has no choice but to learn to dance with the big gorilla. And a couple of years later, I published a paper with Julian Birkinshaw of London Business School titled Dancing with Gorillas, which was from the point of view of the startup. But over time, as I've just said, I've noticed that big companies have been learning to dance. And so the book is written for a corporate audience. Hence Dancing with Gorillas became Gorillas Can Dance. But I still speak to both audiences, and in the Q&A, happy to look at the other perspective too. So based on this study of Microsoft and the importance of the why, how, and the where, I've structured the book in this way, and I'm going to take you through now the key ideas on each of these. So we start with the why. And I think the first point I'd like to make is, although we talk about companies, large corporations, startups partnering together, in reality, it is people within these companies that partner together. The corporate managers and the startup entrepreneurs. And it is because there are these interpersonal relations involved that coaches like yourselves can actually have a very important role. When I was discussing this topic with my father, who knows your audience far better than I do, he said, coaches can actually provide the background music to the dancing between the gorillas and the startups. And so that, I think, is hopefully something we can explore further in the Q&A in particular. But let me start by saying that, to start with, big companies need to be entrepreneurial. And this is something I'm sure all of you, with many of you are corporate veterans yourselves understand very well. Part of the challenge is that big companies, as Sri said, like to have predictable success, but then when the environment changes, they often perceive strategic threat. And this threat, this sort of disruption, often comes, not always, but in many cases comes from startups on the outside. And so for managers within companies, startups on the outside can be a source of threat. Many years ago, when we were talking about the mobile phone industry, when Nokia was one of the few companies in the world to be in the top 3 in terms of market share in the West, in China, and in India. To say that a computer company called Apple would be the one to come and cause it grief was something that one would not have thought of. Or the automotive companies 15, 20 years ago, recognizing that there may be changes ahead, but that a startup called Tesla would be the one that would come and cause them problems. Clayton Christensen, who talks about who introduced the concept of disruptive innovation, talks about this a lot. So entrepreneurs on the outside can be a source of threat to managers on the inside, because these entrepreneurs are pursuing new opportunities. Through business model innovation, a very different way of thinking, cultivating and tapping into ecosystems with a much more nimble culture. And that was the word that Sri had used. And a lot of this in the past few years has been driven by digitalization. But then being entrepreneurial isn't just for startups. Big companies have actually recognized this for many years. There's a term called intrapreneurship that many of you are familiar with, about big companies trying to be entrepreneurial, and it's sort of gone in and out of fashion over the years, but there's generally been this recognition that, okay, big companies face threats. They can't, steady state will not work, but, and partly this is because of entrepreneurial startups on the outside, but of course, managers also need to be entrepreneurial. And intrapreneurship is often thought of from an internal perspective, right? How do we do things on the inside, learn new ways of doing things, or come up with new products. And one of the classic examples of this is how the Post-it notes, the ubiquitous yellow notes, got created. I'm sure many of you know the story about how it was really kind of a result of a project that didn't go to plan. One of the adhesives that a group of 3M scientists were trying to work on did not quite come out the way it was meant to, but Silver Spencer, one of the scientists, was intrigued by the semi-sticky kind of substance. And in his lunch breaks and so on, he would do brown bag seminars with others in 3M, telling them about this new substance and trying to find a commercial application. But it was only a few years later that he came across someone else who used to sing in a choir and used to be irritated that his bookmark would keep slipping out of the hymn book. And then he got the idea that maybe we could use this substance, and then the 3M note was created. And of course, then 3M has tried to institutionalize this by giving people 15% of their time to pursue on projects of interest to them that could be useful to the company. But another way for managers to be intrapreneurial is actually to be external facing and to help their companies connect with entrepreneurship on the outside. And some of the pictures I showed you when I was talking about Microsoft, Dana Lewin, Zach Weisfeld, James Chaw, I regard them as intrapreneurs who were helping their company connect with entrepreneurship on the outside. And so the theme of my book is really about now, so how can managers work with entrepreneurs? And in fact, even more internally focused intrapreneurship efforts have recognized that external startups can be useful. Kapil Kane is a Shanghai-based executive working with Intel in China, and he runs the Intel China Intrapreneurship Program, which is called GrowthX. And so every year they have 2 sets of internal teams that are given the opportunity to develop their own ideas and so on. But he discovered that getting even those internal teams to, on occasion, engage with external startups can be very helpful because, for example, one of their internal teams had developed a smart recognition tool that could be used on doors so that you smile at the door and then it opens. And they were going to work with one of the Intel China business units to bring it to market in 9 months. But Kapil discovered that there was a startup in Hangzhou in China that was also into this space, and they showed a lot of interest to work on this and take it to market. They did it in 3 months. And so you can see the value. So, I mean, clearly there's a potential opportunity. Sri put it very well when he talked about the 2 cultures. You know, there's a potential win-win. Each side has something the other wants. The startups have the agility, the large companies have the scale and the legitimacy. And so there's a lot of potential there. Okay. Next slide, though, is the but, without which there would have been no need for this book. You know, and this is the key challenge that I find, and this is what I devote another chapter on, is that partnering, even though it makes eminent sense, is not easy. Jeremy Bassett, who created the startup engagement program at Unilever, which is called Foundry, he says it's very difficult for a large organization to stimulate the same sort of incentives and flexibility that exists for an entrepreneur. We come from this background of plan and perfect. We research things very well. When we launch things, we really invest in them. This is the antithesis of what is needed in an entrepreneurial environment. And so basically you have a paradox, what I call the paradox of asymmetry. The very differences that make corporations and startups attractive to each other also make it difficult, or at least not straightforward, to partner with. And so if I were to pick one key idea from the book, it is what I'm going to get into now, and that is, it is important to unpack what the asymmetries are and find ways to address them. And 3 asymmetries that I have consistently found to be an important part of the challenge are the asymmetry of goals, which is that these two sets of companies are trying to achieve different things, but also at different timescales. For startups, sometimes if they don't get an answer in 2 weeks, they could die. For a big company, that could be lightning speed. There's an asymmetry of structure. It's not easy to find role counterparts. When two big companies are talking to each other, far easier. The vice president marketing can identify their counterpart and will probably have their email answered or whatever, but it's much different in these two very different types of companies. And finally, the asymmetry of attention, by which I mean the big companies looks out and sees an ocean of startups with cool sounding names and PowerPoint decks and don't know which ones are worth giving their limited managerial attention to. The startups know who the big companies are, but they struggle to get the attention of the decision makers or the key individuals that matter. And so the first part in terms of what I talk about the how is about how do you address these asymmetries. And then there's a second part which says, well, once you know that process, how do you actually embed that within the company? So the first part to this is partnering with startups systematically. And now, people say if companies, big corporations don't talk to startups, they're at risk. The bit that companies need to get right is partnering. This is Gerald Brady from Silicon Valley Bank. So if we go back to those three asymmetries, the question is, how do we address each of these? And what I have observed in companies from different industries, different parts of the world, they tend to do three things to address each of these asymmetries. The first is clarifying the synergy, which helps to address the goal asymmetry. The second is creating partner interfaces that helps to address the structure asymmetry. And the third is cultivating exemplars or success stories, which helps both sides then to know what success could look like and thereby allocate their limited managerial attention more efficiently. In other words, address attention asymmetry. Okay, so let me quickly talk through each. So although it sounds blindingly obvious, and people talk about win-win all the time, sometimes it's not actually crystal clear what the win might look like, what the win really is for both sides. Now, I am abstracting from what I've observed in different companies. And so just as a sort of a higher level, I would categorize two major synergies that I've seen. One that I call building block-based synergies and the other pain point-based synergies. With the building block synergies, very often the focus is how can we get startups to build solutions using technological building blocks that we have, and then we might be able to co-sell such that the startup gets revenue for their solution and the large corporation gets some revenue as well for the technology of theirs that's bundled with that solution. And this was in fact the initial efforts that I observed on the part of the likes of Microsoft, SAP, IBM, and so on, as they were engaging with startups. And I would say it was the information technology companies in many ways that were pioneering this process. But over time, we've also seen companies, say in the automotive sector, realizing that they had pain points to address. They were influenced by this digital revolution, but having pain points around cybersecurity, say. And so they're looking for solutions for these problems and looking for startups who could sell to the corporation, but not in an arm's length vendor relationship. In fact, many of these startups don't even qualify to be vendors because the procurement rules of big companies often says that their suppliers should have 3 years of continuous profit. And some of these startups are not even 3 years old to begin with. So, and also when these solutions are related to strategic imperatives of the company, they are much more than arm's length suppliers. They're actually strategic partners. And so, but making this clear at the outset is important. In terms of the interfaces, there are two broad types of interfaces that I have observed. One that I call cohorts and the other that I call funnels. The way I explain this to my MBA students is that cohort is like an MBA class. getting into the cohort is difficult, but once you get in, there's a group of people who go through the process together. It's time bound, there's a structured curriculum. And unless you really screw up, everybody who starts the program ends the program. And peer interaction is a big part of it. Funnels, on the other hand, is like the job search process after the MBA. Many more finish the process than start. You are screened out along the way, and you may not know who else is part of the process. So the approach of cohorts, where you have batches of startups coming together, is typically found in corporate accelerators. Sri, I know, was involved in running one for Bosch. I mentioned how Zach Weisfeld started one in Microsoft, which was then replicated in different parts of the world. And various companies do have these accelerator programs. But by contrast, you also have these funnel-based approaches, more like an innovation challenge type approach, where the big company identifies upfront what they're looking for and then screens out startups in a funnel-like process to identify the startups they want to. And this, of course, has the strength of having more predictable outcomes. But what you have with the cohorts is the prospect of serendipity, unexpected opportunity. Two startups that didn't know each other from Adam might end up working together. And then finally is the importance of exemplars or success stories. And this is about doing this intentionally, trying to cultivate these startup successes early on. And that's important because just like a business school with great alumni can attract other high quality applicants, it becomes useful to attract high quality startups. But over time, what I found is actually the even more important role of these startups of these success stories is to persuade internal audiences within the large company. Because once you have an interface, say Unilever Foundry, the people working for the interface, they do have KPIs to talk to startups. But the startups will only have proper opportunities if business unit leaders, brand managers are willing to give meaningful projects. And many of them may be risk averse and skeptical. And so being able to show success stories can be helpful. But now that's one part of the how, because you want to go beyond being a one-time, a one-hit story. So if this is to become a replicable capability, then that is something that needs to be developed over time. This is a quote from a manager from SAP who said, while our organization is very good at partnering with large partners, ERP solutions were used by all the big companies. The first time they set up their startup partnering program, he said, first time we had engaged with partners at the opposite end of the spectrum. Talk about a learning curve. At first, most of them were actually confused when we approached them. Why the heck is SAP talking with us? So it takes time to develop a process, a capability. We know the process, synergy, interface, exemplar, but how do you build this as a capability to make it replicable? So first of all, I think the important thing to recognize is that it needs to be initiated. Sometimes companies suffer from paralysis by analysis. With this sort of thing, I think the important thing is to do what Simon Sinek says: think big, start small, but get started. And in fact, you have a lot of under the radar efforts. Sometimes this is where the bottom-up intrapreneurial efforts, like Zach Weisfeld in Israel, you get started. But that of itself is not going to be enough if it has to become a capability. There needs to be expansion of this over time, and then ultimately systematizing it where it really becomes mainstream. And it takes genuine effort. It's a painful learning process. And it ultimately involves winning the hearts and minds of startups, because big companies have recognized that they are competing for the best startup partners. And within the company, it needs entrepreneurial individuals to take the lead. So in terms of initiation, there are many ways in which to get started. I'll just give one simple example, and that is that for companies that are relatively late to the party, one of the things that they might want to do is to basically take a shortcut. So when Walmart in China decided to create what I would call a funnel, a program called Omega 8 to identify partners to develop some solutions for their pain points. Instead of starting from scratch, they went to Microsoft, who is one of their technology partners, and said, "You have a great accelerator program. Can we talk to your most relevant alumni, the ones with solutions that are relevant for a retail company?" And Microsoft very gladly, at no fee, organized a weekend hackathon with 8 startups from their alumni database that had retail tech solutions. And after that, 3 of them got shortlisted to work with Walmart on some pilot projects. Why was Microsoft willing to do that? Because in the end, their startup alumni were going to get a large corporate client and use more of Microsoft technologies. And so it was really a win for 2 gorillas, and gave Walmart the ability to get started relatively quickly as a newcomer. And I've seen this also being mentioned by other founders of corporate startup partnering programs like Gregor Gimme and BMW. Get started, ask for forgiveness rather than permission. But that's only going to get you started, right? Over time, there needs to be expansion, and very important part of this process is getting buy-in from various internal stakeholders. Shilpa Patel set up the Nissan Group's first startup accelerator program in Hong Kong, because their luxury brand called Infinity is headquartered there. And talking with Shilpa, I understood that she was dealing with at least 3 different types of entities within the company. One is the senior or top managers who were like internal champions. Like the CEO then started talking about the startup partner program in the town halls and basically giving it legitimacy. She was talking to people in the business units, sort of other middle managers, her peers, encouraging them to give meaningful opportunities for these startups, but also working with a range of what I call roving ambassadors within the company who would be familiar with the program, be willing to serve as mentors, and so on. And so this role of boundary spanning within the company is actually extremely important. And I would argue more challenging and important, the internal boundary spanning than the external. Because once you get the hang of dealing with these startups, the startups, even though I said big companies are competing for the hearts and minds of startups, the startups are also, in general, positively inclined to work with good, large corporate partners. The challenge on the inside, though, can be considerable. And that is a big piece of this, because only when that internal buy-in occurs is it possible to repeat the process, refine it, and thereby refine it, but also get it rolled out maybe in different geographies or across different businesses. And finally, arguably the most important piece is systematizing this and making this mainstream. Bayer is another company that I've studied over time, and their partnering program with startups is called Grants for Apps, shortened to G4A. It started as a very small passion project of a very entrepreneurial Cuban scientist in Berlin, and it developed over time. It got expanded to different markets around the world, in Spain, in US, in China. By 2018, they were able to then make it into a very solid, systematic program with 3 different sections, and it started becoming a well-oiled machine. One of the most interesting things, though, was that the guy who started G4A was then replaced as the head, and someone else was brought in, because from now on, it had to be run and managed in a slightly different way. This is Hazel Delval, the founder of G4A. And so the point of this is that figuring out how to partner with startups is only the first step, the synergy interface exemplar. The hard work is actually, once this is initiated, to expand and systematize. And this is where, in fact, corporate executives need a lot of help, and I'm sure coaching can be very useful for. But equally on the other side, I'm sure coaches can help entrepreneurs to be more systematic and thoughtful in how they engage with these large companies. There are also external specialists like Techstars who actually help large companies to put together these startup partner programs. And it's important to understand what they're particularly good at. Do they focus on cohorts or funnels? Where's their geographic strength and so on. Now, the last part, and I'll go through this a little bit quickly, is that startup partnering in multinationals takes place in different parts of the world. This is clearly seen in the case of Microsoft's own startup journey, as I've already mentioned. And I think it's useful. I'm based in China. Most of you are based in India. And I think it's one useful distinction is between advanced markets and emerging markets, right? So China and India being important emerging markets. But also a lot of what I've talked about, if you look at where within a country these examples are from, they will be from the high reputation locations, the hotspots, the clusters, whatever you want to call them. Silicon Valley, Bangalore, Shenzhen, Berlin, and so on. But I'm from a town called Vellore, and I've always had a soft spot for places that are off the beaten track. And one of the things that I've actually observed in my studies is that while a lot of the startup partnering happens in these innovation clusters, there are instances where it's happened off the beaten track too, which could be useful for some companies. So if you take the default, Silicon Valley, the Thames Valley region, including London, Berlin, and so on, advanced market clusters, that's where there's probably the least friction. But then you have places like Glasgow in Scotland, also in an advanced economy, but really not very famous for tech entrepreneurship. Even there, I have seen corporates partnering with startups. And the way that has happened is through public policy intervention. Now, in the likes of Bangalore, Zhongguancun, Beijing, Shenzhen, and so on, we've also seen some interesting examples of startups partnering with large corporations. But in these locations, there has typically been some sort of adaptation to take into account that emerging markets may have some differences. Some of the institutions may be less mature. The appetite for entrepreneurship is very high. And so this energy has to be tapped. But there are also places like Ningbo, a city in China that's well known for entrepreneurship in general, but not tech entrepreneurship, where also I have seen companies like IBM engage with local startups. And here, just like in Glasgow, the entrepreneurial behavior of government officials, policy makers, can also play a very important role. And so I guess the key point here is, as the sort of second tier, third tier cities in countries like India develop, and there's a strong interest in developing entrepreneurship in these types of places, I think it's important to realize that there's another actor that also needs to be entrepreneurial, and that's the government as well. I've had the privilege also in recent years to travel to Africa a few times, and I've been noticing with interest some of the partnering there. But one of the key things that my work in Africa has drawn to my attention is the fact that this can also be a force for good. And it can be, the sustainable development goals that the United Nations talks about can only be achieved by if private sector business plays an important role, and corporate startup partnering, I believe, can be thought of as an important part of SDG 17, which is partnerships for the goal. These non-traditional allies, large and small companies working together. But for this, we might need to modify a little bit the synergy interface exemplar framework. Synergy can't just be the synergy between the big company and the startup. It needs to be a win-win-win, with the third win being for society. So there needs to be a societal synergy, particularly now in this decade of action. And COVID has made things even more important, has made this even more urgent, more difficult, but more urgent. And the interface may have to be more inclusive. It needs to involve non-traditional actors like the United Nations or social entrepreneurship hubs. Reach for Change is an NGO that tries to connect corporates and startups. And the exemplars, the success stories need to be hybrid. They need to have economic payoff and societal impact. One example of which in the area of SDG 3, health during the COVID, the horrible second wave that happened last year in May in India. Cloud Physician is a startup in Bangalore, which is an alumnus startup of the Cisco Launchpad. And they collaborate, they provide remote services for intensive care units, which is very valuable, particularly in second and third tier cities in India. And when there was this horrible outbreak of COVID, their digital technologies came in very handy. SDG 6, Clean Water and Sanitation. Kusini is a South African startup that worked with DHL to bring their water filters to hard-to-reach parts of South Africa. And in terms of climate change, Budweiser in China is working with the Chinese startup called Metero to turn some of their beer waste into recyclable materials. Microsoft, the company I've studied the longest, in fact now has a global social entrepreneurship program. Final thought that I will end with, and I hope this is particularly relevant from a coaching point of view. If you weren't interested in corporates or startups or their interactions, and I know this audience is, but even if you weren't, I think what I see is 3 mindsets which are relevant for any executive or entrepreneur to think about. When I talked about the why, I think the underpinning mindset there that's important is the entrepreneurial mindset. When we talk about the how, it's the collaborative mindset. And we think about the where, it's a global mindset. That, of course, applies to what I'm talking about, but more generally to organizational transformation and ultimately to social impact. And let me close with this quote from Paul Polman, the former CEO of Unilever. It's imperative for large organizations to partner with more nimble startups to help create a better world. So thank you very much. I hope you found this whistle stop tour of some use, and I look forward to our conversation now. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Shameen. That was really a exciting, fascinating topic. And you made it sound so simple, such a complex topic of how corporates really can partner with. I think what I can say, you have taught us step by step how to dance. So that's the way I look at it. With the good models and frameworks you have explained. Thanks a lot for that. What we will do is few questions from Jagdish and me as the moderators now, and then we'll throw it open to the audience. By the time, I think I would request our esteemed coaches and other external corporate people who have joined, please keep typing in on the chat any questions you have. That will be better. We'll pick you and make you ask the question so that we can have a sequence and prioritization. Please go ahead and keep doing that on the chat while I start with the first question and Jagdish would continue. Dr. Shameen, it's interesting you mentioned in the book also that you picked up this title from Professor C.K. Prahalad in 2006, that startups must learn to dance with the gorillas. But after 15 years, in today's context, what has changed really? Because we see even tech majors like Microsoft to the traditional ones like Walmart, you have explained, are collaborating with startups. So what should the corporates or the gorillas learn today, and what has changed and why it has changed in the 15 years?
That's a great question. You know, what CK had said was small companies don't have a choice but to learn with large gorillas. And I'm sure if he was alive and we asked him this question now, he would say, and the big gorillas have no choice but to learn to dance with startups. And I think, obviously, you know, you used the term VUCA when you were introducing me, and the speed at which innovation needs to occur now has increased so much that this notion of open innovation that Berkeley professor Henry Chesbrough introduced a number of years ago, I think is something people recognize. I mean, so What has changed, I think, is there's a lot more humility on the part of corporations who recognize that they can't do it alone, and also the recognition that you don't have to do it alone. And so this another excellent professor who has written along these lines is Ron Adner at Dartmouth, who talks about the ecosystem mindset. And I think that is a big change. When I wrote the 2008 article, Dancing with Gorillas, the examples I had were all very ad hoc. They were happy accidents. There was either a very entrepreneurial manager in a big company who, although nobody else in his company was thinking about it, he, and at that time they were all he's, was reaching out to startups. Or there was a startup entrepreneur who had the audacious idea to reach out to a big company and say, hey, we want to talk to you. They were all happy accidents. But by the time I've done the book, I mean, there's so much more systematic efforts on the parts of companies, including your former one, Bosch.
Thanks a lot. Jagdish, please.
Hey, Shameen, it's been, it was a fantastic presentation. I read the book, but what you gave in the presentation was a lot more than what is there in the book, and a different perspective, and probably pressing the right buttons. It was fantastic. Thank you so much. Just a quick question. You've done research across countries. Just wanted to check with you, how was the entrepreneur mindset different across geographies? Is it just cultural, or is it something more than that?
You know, it's a great question. Also a very big complex area. So just to simplify it, let me talk about 3 countries that I think are extraordinarily interesting. They're relatively young as modern states, about 75 years old, but very old cultures. So I'm thinking of India, 1947, Israel, 1948, China, 1949. And all 3 with tremendous entrepreneurial ecosystems. And I think, you take a place like Israel, for example. So fascinating how their history and culture has very clearly influenced entrepreneurship. In fact, not so long ago, I had one of my former Israeli students give a guest talk to my students on Zoom from Israel. And he said, for us, because all the Israelis have to do this compulsory military service, he said, when you are dealing with life and death, and then come out of the army and start a startup, he said, everything else is just a game. And so there's something about the willingness to take risks, but also in the case of Israel, just because it's so small, the way in which many of these entrepreneurs don't look to scale is also quite characteristic. I mean, that's beginning to change, but I would say the vast majority of Israeli tech entrepreneurs will create a startup and then within 2 to 5 years, try to have it acquired by another company, very often an American company, and then move on to the next. China is a slightly different story. And I think in China, there are, a bit like India, there are certain regions or communities who have been associated with entrepreneurship over time. But when it comes to tech entrepreneurship now, returnees play a very important role. And one thing very distinct about China is that people pay very close attention to what the government policy nudges are, aligning with the state. But of course, India, I think this audience knows even more than me. I think what we have seen in India over time, at least in the tech space, has been this fascinating transition from leveraging the arbitrage possibilities for services, and you yourself are a veteran in that space, to over time also having startups with intellectual property, a lot of new enterprise solutions. So all that is to say that I think these differences are shaped by a lot more than just culture. I would say institutional influences are big. And the thing about these 2 markets, China certainly China and now more increasingly India, is that scaling, I think, is the big opportunity and challenge when you have a big market, and India's market as it grows gives these greater opportunities.
Yes, I guess, obviously a follow-up on India and China. You're talking of two ecosystems. You've been, obviously you're in China and you're close to India. So how, I want your this thing on the two ecosystems and what can be done to make this better performing.
So China and India have some similarities, but have a lot of differences. One of the key differences that I already mentioned is the role of the state. So in China, the dominance of the state is unmistakable and generally uncontested. So entrepreneurs expect that they should align with the government. But the other thing that has happened, of course, is that China has created its own world in many senses, including in terms of the way the internet developed. And so whereas, they say the Google of China is Baidu and the Facebook of China is Tencent, the Google of India is Google and the Facebook of India is Facebook. And so the rise of these distinct giants in China has been very different from what it is in India. But what has also happened with China is that although a lot of how they began was very much in copycat mode. So we don't get much access to WhatsApp. We have something called WeChat, which basically started as the WhatsApp of China. Today, it's a completely different beast. It's a Swiss Army knife where you have all kinds of different things that you can do just from the WeChat platform. And in fact, some of these American companies are copying ideas from China. Now, when it comes to India, I think in the enterprise space, the developers that I'm seeing have been very impressive. But I would say the thing that China most admires and envies about India is the number of executives who have made it in large global companies. That is something that you find completely different, right? And the number just keeps growing. And I actually attribute this to a very different history of management education in these two countries. India's first business school was the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, which was set up in the 1960s. My understanding is CK was in the very first batch of the MBA program and was one of the 2 gold medalists. But India's economic liberalization program started only in 1991. So the supply of managerial talent was ahead of demand. China opened up in 1978, but its first MBA program was in the school that I worked for, China Europe International Business School, which was set up in 1994. So there was a pent-up demand for managerial talent. And of course, I think Indians also have the benefit of language and so on. So that's simply to say that you actually have 2 very different types of systems with different strengths and weaknesses. I think one thing that the Indians can learn from the Chinese is the focus on growth and scale. Even when you look at some of the more traditional sectors of entrepreneurship, I find Indian entrepreneurs get satisfied more quickly than their Chinese counterparts and then turn to social service and spiritual pursuits, which personally I actually find more appealing. But if you wanted to be hard-nosed and look at it from a business point of view, I am just amazed by the appetite of the Chinese. What I think the Chinese can learn from the Indians is the art of debate. And I see that more and more with my younger students. But the pragmatism of the Chinese and their growth appetite keeps them moving forward. But I think without the debate that we see that comes very naturally in India, it's also possible that they will leave certain key issues unattended.
But I thought there is also one more area of focus where Chinese startups are more looking at the domestic market, whereas the Indian startups are more focused on delivering to the global market. and delivering in smaller, as you said, China looks at scale, whereas Indian startups are looking at smaller parcels, but the focus primarily has been more global. So Indians have a chance to actually grow globally. So where is the problem is kind of, I was wondering, where your market you're looking at is a global market, but you're still being smaller. So where is the mindset issue?
No, I think that's a very fair comment. I think part of the difference is this. I think in general, the Chinese economy is bigger than the Indian economy. So the Chinese domestic market is bigger than the Indian domestic market. But that, of course, has actually been changing over time. When I think back to 2002, and when I started my doctoral work studying Indian software services companies, they weren't even looking at the Indian market, but over time, the Indian market is there. But you're absolutely right. Where the size of the market makes a difference. The other is that the Indians have the ability to engage with different cultures and so on, partly due to linguistic advantages, I think. So a lot of it is ultimately about where opportunity lies and where it isn't. The Chinese companies that do a lot of work in their domestic market, have a very big domestic market, but they would love to go global too. Their problem, because the domestic market in China is cutthroat, it's so competitive, but they don't always have the soft skills that they would like, and right now they're also not very popular outside. And so I think Indian entrepreneurs should make the most of their global credentials.
Thanks, Dr. Shameen. I think we'll move to audience questions. We'll come back with some more questions later. I think I'll go in sequence. I think first Raghu raised hand. Raghu, go ahead. We can't hear you. I don't know if you're muted, Raghu.
Earplugs. Thank you, Dr. Shameen, for this insightful presentation. I remember Lou Gessner, chairman of IBM, wrote Why Elephant Can't Dance, which is about internal transformation of IBM. I think this is the next level of dancing, which is you have to reach out to startups, which is where the gorillas can dance. Thanks for this insightful presentation also. My question is, if you look at India, the MSME, which is the micro, small, medium enterprises, occupy a very large position in the Indian economy. 60 million units and contributing 1/3 of the manufacturing output. Is this framework, does this framework also could apply to the MSME? I mean, they have their own culture, they have their own structure. Is there a way that they could also be part of this kind of a framework? Because I think the attempts possibly made by some of the tech companies have not really reached out to this MSME, or it's very limited reach. So is there a framework that you have seen that it works where you have a large corporation, you have MSMEs and startups, they all come together to create something which is unique?
It's a fantastic question. So the thing about the startup is, of course, the primary definition is around age, right? And many of these MSMEs, where the primary definition is around size, can actually be relatively old and established. So this creates both opportunities and challenges. The big challenge is that some MSMEs are small, but still not very agile, or not as agile as the startups. So part of what the MSMEs have to be thinking about, and again, it's a fairly broad range, right? So especially the ones at the micro end that are really quite small, if they don't lose their startup feel, then there's no reason why they can't also try to tap into the possibility of engaging with large companies and leverage their entrepreneurial abilities. Now, the ones at the medium size, and actually some of the medium ones are not small, they, I think, have a very different type of opportunity. So here I will give you an example from a different part of the world. In Germany, northern Switzerland, and that sort of areas, as you all know, there are a lot of these small and medium-sized companies which are extremely focused, have a very niche focus, but in that area, they are extremely strong. They are called the Mittelstand companies. And I've seen them play two different games. On the one hand, they act like mini gorillas. So they have started, for example, to actively reach out to Israeli startups and say, well, we're not like BMW, but if before you talk to BMW, you want a slightly smaller playing ground, which is more sort of hospitable, and we're really good at a small thing, and you find some way to work with us, we can be a good stepping stone. The other thing they can also do is to spin off some startups and let those startups play the Dancing with Gorillas game. So that is one possibility. So it's basically about recognizing what is the value that these companies can add, and then therefore what type of game to play, and to some extent finding ways to improvise. The other way to think about it, of course, is that what I have described are largely horizontal relationships. And this is what has been relatively new, these corporations building more horizontal relationships with startups. But there are also these much more traditional vertical relationships in supply chains, which is where SMEs sort of more naturally fit in. And now I'm seeing a strong move, a strong call for big companies to make their global value chains and supply chains amenable to giving opportunities to these small and medium-sized enterprises to be more inclusive. Because one of the great advantages of small and medium enterprises to society is the employment they generate. And in fact, they are by far the largest type of firm that exists. Unfortunately, when we speak about companies, we talk about the outliers, right? The few really well-known big companies, and then the few sexy unicorns. But the ones that do the grunt work are these small and medium-sized enterprise. And I would say that actually the bread and butter for them in terms of engaging with big companies will be identifying how to align into these vertical supply chains and make it win-win for both sides.
I suppose that the synergy definition could possibly be different.
That's right, exactly. I fully agree. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for.
Thanks.
Ramesh had a question.
Yeah, yes. Dr. Shameen, I have two questions very briefly.
The first one is free. The second one is 1,000 rupees. So.
Okay, sure. Yep. So Max Weber, in his book, Sociology of Religion, he was linking entrepreneurship to religion. And he was right to some extent, when he was talking about West, and he was erroneously wrong when he was talking about Asia. So did you come across any linkage to that, 15 years of study? That is question number one. Second is, with Elon Musk buying Twitter now, who is a gorilla here who need to learn to dance?
Now, religion, that's a very interesting question, right? Max Weber talked about the Protestant work ethic. And if you go from Northern Ireland to the Republic of Ireland, you definitely see some sort of difference between the Protestant North and the Catholic South. I'm not sure that I see religion as a big influence, partly because when I think about China, it's also very hard to even figure out whether people, to what extent there is or there isn't religion. I think, though, that the more fundamental issue is about the values. And I do see that there are some differences. Ultimately, though, what I have noticed, or what my eye has caught, has been the commonalities more than the differences in terms of the values that I've seen in entrepreneurs, in whether it is in the US or in Israel or in China or in India. And the most dominant one seems to be opportunity, the ability to identify and pursue an opportunity. And when Howard Stevenson, the professor at Harvard, who is credited as being the first person to bring entrepreneurship into the classroom, his definition of entrepreneurship is the pursuit of opportunity without regard to resources currently controlled. And he contrasted that with professional managers whose job is to optimize resources currently controlled. So I think that commonality is what I see across the world, and irrespective of religion, I mean, that's the sort of more of a mindset maybe that's key. And the other is in terms of the value around seeking to create value. That seems to be what I find most pressing. And in fact, let me just add one more thing. The entrepreneurial mindset can be talked about in different ways, but if there were 3 words that I would say best describe it, it would be being proactive, being innovative, and being willing to take risks. And so then the question is, are there do different religions advocate this more than others? I don't know, but I definitely think that individuals vary in their propensity for proactiveness, innovativeness, and willingness to take risk. As for your other question, that's a great one. I don't know. Elon Musk is a character and a half, and now we have this phenomenon of relatively young companies being definitely big. And I know a lot of companies that would regard Tesla as a gorilla, and both a desirable partner to work with, but also with a very intriguing kind of leader. Certainly here in China, Tesla would be considered as a gorilla, and there are many EV supplier startups in the area of battery technology and so on that see working with Tesla as a big plus.
Thank you. Mukul, please go ahead. You had some questions. You're muted, Mukul.
To be honest, my knowledge on the subject that you spoke about was very, very limited. And I think I'm deeply enlightened by whatever you have shared. So thank you so much. I'll also ask a couple of questions, but maybe one at a time to save $1,000 from my side to you. So the first one is more on an empirical side. In your research, maybe something that started 15 years ago, and you've observed companies. So what has happened to these companies, let's say, who were gorillas when they were dancing with the younger companies? And over the years, what trend have you seen? Like, does this dance continue? Do these gorillas kind of over time start doing what the startups were doing, and therefore they don't need them anymore, and therefore they have to go for new people to dance with? That's the first question. Maybe if you can answer that, then I can ask the second one.
So that's a fantastic question. And I think one of the things that's happened actually is that the big companies engage with multiple startups. And so over time, the exemplars end up being a minority. So I think that one needs to recognize. Not all the startups that the big company works with has a necessarily happy ending. But even for the startups that don't get huge success, it still can be useful, and they can leverage that learning and move forward. But what I find is 2-3 potential trajectories. So in one case, one possibility is the big company says, well, I've danced with this startup to deal with this problem at this point in time. Quick tango, I have my solution, and then it's fine, I move on to the next. But in some other cases, actually the big company goes, oh, well, this is actually quite useful for us, and let's try to scale this within our own company. So I'll give you a very concrete example. Walmart in China partnered with a startup from Shenzhen to develop an AI-based solution to simplify or to lessen the pain point around buying loose vegetables and fruit. The customer experience, you put it in a plastic bag, you have to get it weighed, you have to stand in line for that, wait for the lady to wait and put a sticky label, somebody will cut the line, it just irritates the hell out of you. So the AI solution just simplifies it. You put it on the scale, it's a one-click solution, and you get the QR, the barcode, and that's it. But Walmart saw an application for this in their US stores to deal with a completely different problem, which was in-store theft. And so that relationship actually then continued over time. So now I would say the success stories are relatively, it's a minority, and the success stories that continue over time are an even smaller subset of that. But then the final possibility, and which is something that the big companies do pay attention to, is this an acquisition target? When the startup has something that is extremely complementary to the big company, and which the big company doesn't think they are going to do themselves, that's when that happens. I'll just say one more thing. I think one of the reasons why the phrase dancing with gorillas resonated with a lot of people is from the startup's point of view, there's a hint of danger. So it is possible that a startup has a decent initial relationship with a big company, and then the big company decides to get into that space themselves. That's when the startup can get trampled. And so my advice to startups is, be absolutely optimistic and positive and pessimistic and cautious at the same time when you're dealing with the big company.
Great. No, thank you so much. I think this is what I was wondering, that it could probably go in many directions, depending on the industry, the product, the situation. Yeah, so my next question is maybe an extension of this, but on a larger scale. We are all living in this VUCA world and everything is changing. And so larger companies are also learning now, and they're learning very fast, and their managers are learning, right? How to become more agile, how to be more nimble, or in a sense, even managers in larger companies are becoming more entrepreneurial, in their outlook, in the way of being. So with this happening, do you see this dance to be continuing for a longer time, or this is something that it may continue, but with a different focus, or something may change? Because it probably will not continue the same way. I mean, that's my suspicion.
Your question actually just prompted me to remember something I wanted to say for a previous question, and I missed, but it relates to your question as well. When we were talking about Israel, one of the things that's very distinctive about Israel is that it is okay to fail. That's a message that gets conveyed very early on, and failure is worn like a badge of honor. And in terms of what you just said about now big companies learning to move fast and so on, I think it is the tolerance for failure. When that increases, that's when managers feel empowered to give it a go. And then you're not trying to avoid mistakes. You're willing to take risks in search of new opportunities. Now, will this then necessarily reduce the need for startup partnering? Only time will tell. I have always seen internal intrapreneurship and external startup partnering as complements rather than substitutes. Some people seem to think if you do one to replace the other. I can't see either being totally adequate, even startup partnering. I don't think that has ever been meant to replace the internal efforts. And I think the internal efforts, like in the case of Intel China, finding that when it worked with a startup, it reduced the time to market by 3 times. I mean, there will still be things that startups will be able to do faster and better. And so I think what will happen over time is that managers and companies will develop a more sophisticated idea of what makes sense to do in-house and what makes sense to do with external startups.
Yeah, I guess probably managers are not incentivized enough to take those risks.
Yeah.
Mr. Raj Swaminathan had a comment.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah.
I think you're muted.
Yeah, my comment, Shameen, thanks a lot. It was absolutely a fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed it. I had a comment which actually follows from what Ashwath Damodaran, the famous valuation guru, talks about, where he says companies have a life cycle. They grow from young to adolescence to maturity to growth, and then they die. And companies, therefore, must act their age and must not, large companies must not dance as youngsters. I mean, using your term. And young companies must not act like very large grown-ups. Essentially, what he's saying is it could be value destructive if they try otherwise. And therefore probably suggesting that partnership is the only answer. I mean, I'm thinking of, for example, when GE thought of getting into the digital age, and they came up with a software product called Predix, which never actually worked the way for them. I mean, it was huge money down the drain, but I think their cause would have been better served if they'd actually partnered with so much of their software partnerships globally.
Thank you. That's very sort of affirming of this idea that seeking complementarity makes sense, because it allows each set of companies to act their age and play to their respective strengths. So that is very much aligned with the thinking here, and relating it to what these ideas around corporate finance. I think that makes perfect sense to me. So thank you for sharing.
Sharada had a question.
Yeah, Shameen's presentation was really insightful, and I think a lot has already been said, which I wanted to share. There is one thing which probably, if this dance has started, is bound to continue, and obviously there is a lot of synergy or opportunity that is being seen by both. Is an assumption, and I'm sure it's based on a lot of empirical data that you have shared so far. So the one thing that strikes me is a thing as coaches, I'm seeing it from that point of view, is these are two polarities. You know, a gorilla is established, well seasoned, if I can use those words, versus startups which are dynamic and volatile. Each have their unique strengths. I think making this dance is a very conscious, deliberate strategy for both. And discovering the strengths in each, creating that synergy along those lines is a way forward. So how would you like to, comment on this?
Well, my first comment is I fully agree with everything you said. And I think the role that coaches have to play is potentially great, particularly in helping individuals process what they have to do, because in the end, it's about individuals working together. Now, many of you in this audience, as I understand, have a lot of corporate experience and coach people from large corporations. And one of the things you can help them to do is actually to develop a sense of empathy or other-centeredness to basically try and understand where the startup is coming from, or the entrepreneur on the other side is coming from, the needs that they have, which could be very different. So I think that becomes extremely useful. I also think, as I was saying in response to an earlier question, this idea of an entrepreneurial mindset, being proactive, innovative, willing to take risks. I think that is also something in which corporate managers can gain a lot from a useful coach. But I also think there's a lot with that type of knowledge that coaches can share with the startup entrepreneurs who are engaging with large companies, again, to be able to see the corporate's point of view. Because unless the entrepreneur or a member of the top management team has had experience working in a corporation, they also struggle to pitch the value that they can add in a way that makes sense to the corporate. So you may have a startup that's talking about the wonders of their technology without identifying how it relates to the business. And I think that's where coaching can have a big impact. But the other thing, of course, is thinking strategically on the part of the startup. So you said that it's off, that it is a deliberate, well thought through dance. And I mean, I think that is the ideal. And I think in the cases of the exemplars, that would be true, but probably the majority of the interactions that happen aren't as strategic on either side as they could be. And I think one of the things that entrepreneurs can get a lot of help from coaches in understanding is also that strategic part, anything to do with strategy, is a choice, which includes choosing when not to do something. So what partners to not pursue is actually, or what prospective partners to not pursue from a strategic point of view, I think is also some very useful value that coaches can add. So, I mean, I think many of you are actually at a very sweet spot of being able to add value to managers from the corporate side to start opening their eyes and look at the perspective of the entrepreneurs. But you can actually add a lot of value to entrepreneurs and help them to navigate this dance and develop the right interpersonal skills.
And the mindset.
And the minds, absolutely, yes.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks
It's
a lot.
a wonderful.
We are coming to the time end. I think Ganesh, can we go ahead and close now formally?
Sri Sharda had a comment before we do that.
Yeah. Okay.
Please go ahead. Sharda, please go ahead.
No, she's
Okay.
Jagdish, please go ahead.
Yes, I think it's been a very engaging, wonderful session, and probably come at the right time for us, because as CFI, trying to see how to get into this segment of coaching entrepreneurs and startups, and where can we find a niche. And I guess it's very clear that the help is required from both from a entrepreneur side as well as from the enterprises side. And I guess, yes, we're definitely in a sweet spot. We need to really see how we can gear ourselves to make this happen. It's been a real eye-opening session. It's been a fantastic, engaging session. I think last 90 minutes just flew like that. So thank you, Dr. Shameen. It's been a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for kicking this off.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure, a great honor, and I thoroughly enjoyed this. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.